With all the inequality being brought to light these days, it only makes sense to illuminate one of the biggest and oldest industries in the United States and the world over, the automotive industry. It accounts for over 3% of the GDP of the entire United States. And beyond that, the auto industry is a massive consumer of goods. The total job impact of the auto industry is 8 million. That's approximately 4.5% of all the jobs in the US. So I think it goes without saying, the car industry is an integral part of America. It shouldn't come as a surprise then that, like America, the auto industry has had its fair share of battles with racism, sexism, and discrimination over the years. Today, the American conversation is all about civil rights. So let's take a look at the battles that have been fought in the boardrooms and factory floors of the biggest names in cars, and how those battles helped civil rights in America move forward, how they fell short, and what we can take away from them in order to better shape the conversation that we're having today. Now, if you want to show progress, you gotta start from the roots. And while the fruits of the automotive revolution were brilliant, the roots were surprisingly unsavory. In the early 1900s, Ford was making a name for itself in the automotive world. Henry Ford was perfecting the assembly line and ramping up production of the Model T at an exponential rate. By 1920, they were producing 1 million cars a year, which for the time was insane. This massive production effort meant that Ford needed a factory to match, so they set out to build the Ford Rouge factory complex. Now, this was a massive facility that went on to become the largest integrated factory in the world. The first phase of the factory to be completed was the Rouge Foundry, a massive steel frame structure full of deathly hot furnaces, melting down metal to be cast into engine blocks and brake drums. This was such a big foundry, it was estimated that they burned 5,500 tons of coal every single day to keep the furnaces burning. When Ford opened the Rouge Foundry in 1920, workers who worked there made a premium. They had to work in extreme heat, suffered burns, and breathed in these noxious gases all day long. It was difficult, dangerous work, but many people still signed on because they felt that the extra pay was worth it. But in 1927, as Model T sales began to decline, Ford saw some serious financial hardships. With the new Model A on the horizon, Ford decided to shut the Rouge Foundry down completely and retool for 6 months in preparation for the next model. When they opened 6 months later, Ford disproportionately assigned black workers to the Rouge Foundry, and they got rid of the premium pay. And over the next few years, as job segregation became more and more the norm in America, Ford's wage differential between black and white workers grew to a massive 11%. So now the Ford Rouge Foundry was mostly run by black workers doing more dangerous work than their white co-workers and getting paid up to 11% less. Ford assigning black workers to the Rouge Foundry became more and more of a trend, to the point that the Rouge became known as the Black Department. And on top of all this, the black workers at Rouge were incessantly policed and scrutinized by their superiors for no real valid reason. You'd think the extra eyes would lend itself to Ford making sure that their workers were safe and free from harm in this fairly dangerous factory. Yet, black workers who worked in Rouge saw a much higher rate of burn injuries and still inhaled all those nauseous fumes. This resulted in much higher death rates compared to other workers at Ford, with tuberculosis and pneumonia being the number 1 and 2 causes. Nevertheless, people still needed jobs, and Ford accounted for a massive part of the economic growth of Black Detroit in the 1920s. As early as 1922, black men made up about 26% of the total Rouge workforce. And by 1940, about half of all black men in the Detroit metropolitan area were employed by Ford. Now, as time went on, these grievances piled up, so black automotive workers went to the established unions to see if they could help them fight for their rights in the workplace. But among the over 24 established unions that existed, every single one of them had a whites-only policy. Black Americans, despite making up a massive part of the workforce at Ford, had no real voice in determining their own fate on the job. But in 1936, the NNC, or National Negro Congress, decided to work together with the UAW to help organize for black workers. The UAW, or United Automobile Workers Union, was established just 1 year prior in 1935. And being so new on the scene, they decided it was worth it to join forces with the NNC. By the fall of 1937, there were a number of official black members of the UAW union, and it even created a UAW subcommittee specifically for addressing the issues of the black community. This mobilization of black workers eventually led to FDR signing an executive order in 1940 to create the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which, while was poorly funded due to opposition from the South, still brought more recognition to the fight that black automotive workers had been fighting all these years. The following year, the UAW organized a massive walkout on April 4th, 1941, and Ford finally got a taste of the damage that the new unionized workers could give them. For 10 days, Ford's workers led a massive sit-down strike and all but halted Ford's production. Ford fought all they could to quell the union strike and bring them back to work, but to no avail. It was only on the 10th day that Henry Ford's wife Clara told him to do the right thing and do right by the workers. And then he finally caved. By May, Ford and UAW had hammered out a contract that addressed the issues that all the workers had been seeing, and, crucially, had an anti-discrimination clause in it as well. And while conditions were still far from perfect, changes were finally being made to give black workers the representation that they deserve. By 1944, the UAW had made the Fair Employment Practices Department, which provided black workers with a direct outlet to express their grievances against workplace discrimination and fight for civil rights at their jobs. It took decades, but black automotive workers finally began to see a move towards real equality at Ford. But all was not right in the world, and the UAW was not the perfect egalitarian organization that a lot of people made them out to be. Post-World War II in the 70s and 80s, America's economy was really slumping. At the same time, Japan's economy was growing at an insane rate. Japanese cars began coming to the United States, especially due to the 1973 oil crisis. The rising fuel prices caused US automakers to lose market share to foreign manufacturers who placed more emphasis on fuel efficiency. So naturally, instead of making better cars, a campaign was made to slander Japanese cars and convince Americans to keep buying American cars. The UAW staged rallies where they destroyed Japanese cars on the street, Street Fighter style, and blamed Japan for the decline of the US car industry and for all the subsequent unemployment of a huge number of auto workers. The union banned Japanese cars from parking lots at union offices and halls. Some union officials threatened workers who parked Japanese cars at work. And to top it all off, the UAW distributed racist bumper stickers with slant-eyed smiley faces on them. This level of blatant racism was reminiscent of the racism that the black workers saw in the 1920s. All this led up to the 1982 murder of Vincent Chin, a Chinese American who was killed by two Chrysler factory workers who hated the Japanese. On June 19, 1982, Chin was beaten to death on the street by Ronald Ebens, a Chrysler supervisor, and Michael Nitz, Ebens' recently laid-off stepson. Earlier that night, the two had yelled racist insults at Chin and his friends at a bar where Chin was having his bachelor party celebrating his upcoming marriage. After Chin and his friends left, Ebens and Nitz tracked them down and attacked them with baseball bats. Ebens and Nitz beat Vincent Chin to death with bats. They were arrested and charged with second-degree murder, but managed to plead the charges down to manslaughter and pleaded guilty. They were ordered to pay $3,000 and serve 3 years probation. No jail time. While Ebens and Nitz never denied attacking him, they said it wasn't racially motivated and that they hadn't yelled any racial slurs, despite various witnesses that said that they did. The lenient sentence led to a vocal outcry by Asian Americans, with the president of the Detroit Chinese Welfare Council calling it a $3,000 license to kill. Eventually, a civil suit for the unlawful death of Vincent Chin was settled out of court in 1987. Michael Nitz was ordered to pay $50,000, and Ronald Ebens was ordered to pay $1.5 million. Years later, Congressman John Conyers looked back at the case and suggested that the reason for the injustices of Chin's case was that it was a political hot potato that didn't get picked up for quote-unquote political reason, due to its close connection with the then fragile automotive industry. Anything that could have further destabilized automakers at the time was seen as too dangerous to the American economy, and thus the case was essentially swept under the rug. But as much of a blatant injustice as this case was, stricter hate crime laws eventually did make their way into US legislation. Slowly, more and more states began enacting their own laws protecting a growing list of marginalized groups. From 1994 to 2018, the Department of Justice recorded a about 16% decrease in hate crimes across the board. And while there are a variety of factors that can be attributed to this, the stricter hate crime laws that came into play the years following Vincent Chin's death certainly played a role. It's important to recognize, however, that these aren't just remnants of America's past. We are still far from eradicating racism in even the most forward-thinking of America's automobile industry. In 2018, the New York Times investigated a number of allegations of racist and discriminatory practices against black workers at Tesla's Fremont factory. This was on the heels of a 2017 lawsuit against Tesla, filed by 3 former employees accusing Tesla of allowing racial discrimination and harassment to occur, sometimes on a daily basis, and not doing much in the way of curbing it. Owen Diaz, one of the former employees suing, was repeatedly harassed, called the N-word, and found swastikas and other racist drawings all around the Fremont plant. One of those drawings having been drawn by his supervisor, and after 11 months of nothing being done to resolve it, he quit. Another former employee, Nigel Jones, was a mobile equipment supervisor at the Fremont factory. In January 2018, a manager had muttered racial slurs to Jones and 2 other black workers. Understandably, Jones was frustrated, so he took to social media to vent about the racism and discrimination he was seeing at work. A few weeks later, he was fired for attendance violations. And if that wasn't enough, perhaps the most blatant injustice that occurred at Tesla's Fremont factory happened to DeWitt Lambert, a production associate that was hired in 2015. Soon after starting, he said other employees used to mock his southern accent, he was from Alabama, and call him various racial slurs. He asked to be moved to a different station on the production line, and Tesla granted him that request. But it wasn't long before his coworkers sought him out and continued harassing him again. He told his superiors that he was worried that his harassers would, quote, do something to him. And between June 2016 and February 2017, he sent at least a dozen different messages, emails, photos, and videos to Tesla's HR department with proof of the abuse he was receiving. This includes a 58-second video with a coworker threatening to, quote, cut him up so everybody can have a piece of you. At this point, this was a clear violation of his rights. So Lambert contacted a lawyer and filed a complaint with the California Fair Employment Agency. Almost immediately, Tesla's legal team went to Lambert with a settlement offer. Quote, $100,000, but only if we are to resolve this matter before there is any media attention. But Lambert didn't accept that settlement. The lackadaisical enforcement of the rights of workers at Tesla's Fremont factory was too much for just a cash settlement. Lambert and his legal team tried to push the case to trial, to which Tesla responded by putting Lambert on administrative leave, and by June had terminated his employment, saying that Mr. Lambert had been involved in acts inconsistent with Tesla's values. The court case was moved to private arbitration by Tesla, who ended up winning the case on the grounds that the racial slurs that Lambert faced were not actually racist. Rather, they were, quote, consistent with lyrics and images commonly found in rap songs and freestyle rap competitions. What? Now, I don't want to make it seem like Tesla is the villain of the automotive industry. Rather, the issue is less with one specific company as it is with corporations having the legal power to quash issues of race and discrimination. Oftentimes, employee contracts stipulate in the fine print that an employee cannot litigate the employer in public court. Rather, they must settle the lawsuit in private arbitration, similar to what happened to DeWitt Lambert, which is considered an almost guaranteed win for the corporations. On the other hand, in 2017, there was a very similar situation to Tesla's at Ford, which ended in a very different outcome. Ford settled with workers to the tune of $10.1 million on charges of sexual and racial harassment. The U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, investigated and found that employees at 2 different Ford plants in Chicago subjected female and black workers to persistent harassment. They also found that some of the other employees at the factories defended the harassment and even retaliated against the victims. Only after the investigation did Ford eventually fire the individuals who were, quote, violating the company's anti-harassment policy. And while the settlement itself can be seen as somewhat of a victory, the EEOC also made Ford agree to conduct regular training at both Chicago plants, monitor its workforce regarding issues of alleged sexual or racial harassment and discrimination, and report any complaints of harassment and or discrimination directly to the EEOC. These rules could be seen as even more important than the settlement because they lay the groundwork to preventing further violations of workers' civil rights. And by holding both the employees and the corporations, in this case Ford, responsible for their action, or in some cases, inaction. So then, it's clear that racism and discrimination are still prevalent in society today, and it only makes sense that the automotive industry would reflect that. The events I've mentioned are just a few of the long list of discriminatory or racist activities that have occurred in the automotive industry. Noteworthy cases include the $190 million lawsuit against Toyota's North American president in 2006, and the more recent 2015 study showing that nearly 20% of Black Americans didn't own a car, more than twice the national average of 9%. But with each grievance came a group of motivated individuals who fought against the systems that oppressed them. And with each victory, no matter how small, they moved the needle forward. Today, representation in the automotive industry is better than it's ever been. General Motors' executive team consists of CTO Matt Cian, CFO Divya Suryadevara, and CEO Mary Barra. Even a few decades prior, the idea of GM being run by a woman, an Indian American, and a Chinese American were unfathomable. And even in motorsports, the current reigning champion is, as you know, Lewis Hamilton, who has been making waves in the news as being the voice of racial justice in the sport. And even on the other side of the pond, Bubba Wallace, NASCAR's only black driver, has been at the forefront of promoting the conversation of equality in a motorsport that has been traditionally associated with a stereotype of intolerance. And while there has been some pushback by some in motorsports, the trend continues to be one of fighting ignorance and making change in establishments that have been known for their stubbornness to change. But having seen the progress that's been made over the last century in the automotive industry, a business so deeply entwined in the story of America, there is hope. The battles won here are a reminder to keep raising our voices against racism and discrimination anywhere, and proof that the diverse people of our nation can enact change. All they need is a focused effort and the undying belief that all people should be treated equally. Thank you guys so much for watching. All of the links for all of the sources in the video can be found in the description box below the like button. If you guys are new here, please don't forget to subscribe. We do cool video essays like these, and we build cool cars like those, and explore car culture all around the world. So I'll see you guys in the next one.